Senator Portman, you're a short timer now, but you've been on the Hill since 1993. You're elected to the House of Representatives. You've served in the administration as the U.S. Trade Representative, the OMB Director, a senator for 2 terms representing Ohio. So I think you're uniquely qualified to offer a perspective on Washington, what works, what doesn't work, what's changed, what hasn't changed, what should happen, what should stay the same. So let me just start. You got here in '93, the year Bill Clinton took office. What's the biggest difference between serving as a member of Congress between 1993, when there was a Republican in the White House, Democrat in the White House and a Democratic-controlled House, and now?
Well, I mean, the obvious difference is it's a little more partisan. You know, politics has changed in America somewhat, and the country is more divided. Some would say polarized even. I still think there's the great middle there, people who aren't very political, who are trying to figure out, you know, how do you elect somebody who's going to get the job done, not somebody who's just going to throw out the red meat on the left or on the right. That's what I've tried to do, be an independent voice for Ohio and focus on results. So I still think there's a way forward on that. I in the last few years, even had some good success with the infrastructure bill, with some anti-drug legislation, with the CHIPS Act, you know, helping Ohio. So there are some differences, for sure. It's harder to get stuff done. There's more partisan gridlock. But by the same token, I do think if you put your head down and focus on results, you can still get stuff done around here. And I've really enjoyed it. I've considered it a real honor to get to represent Ohio.
Who or what is to blame for an increase in partisanship?
I think there's a few different reasons. You can't take you know, the blame away from leadership, because that does matter. So who's in the White House and who's in the Congress does matter. But in many respects, Mike, I think the partisanship in Washington reflects the country right now. I mean, I think members of Congress are pretty well representative back home, which is that back home in your district or your state, depending if it's more red or more blue, people tend to be kind of divided along certain lines. And then finally, I think there is some opportunity here to relook at the primary system, because if you have primaries that determine the outcome of every election, you tend to move people to the left or to the right in order to get through that primary. And then once they're in the general election, if it doesn't really matter because the district is increasingly red or blue, or the state is increasingly red or blue, then you get a more divided Congress here. The other thing I'm going to mention, since we're here with you, the media, is that the media doesn't help.
Right.
One thing I like about your station is you guys are focused on trying to deliver the news, and you know, pride yourselves in saying you're not going to be doing the right or the left. You're going to be going down the middle and focusing on the facts. That's very rare these days. I mean, if you look on cable news, you get 2 different worlds. You know, the same issue is discussed in such different ways, and unfortunately, a lot of people are just looking at one source, and so they aren't taking in the broader points of view. And it's tough to find just a factual source.
Right.
Online, folks are doing the same thing. You know, I go to meetings and people say, you know, I heard this, and why are you guys doing this? I said, actually, that's not true. Who told you that? And they say, well, I saw it online, so of course it's true, you know? And I think you can go down that rabbit hole on the left or on the right pretty deep if you don't make an effort, you know, to try to get a broad source of news. So I think that's exacerbated it. I don't know what the answer is there, because you know, I'm a big First Amendment proponent, and I think, you know, we need to be sure that everybody has the opportunity to speak. But I also think that there are a lot of people who are looking for just the straight news. And again, I hope you guys continue to focus on that and don't allow yourselves to do it. It seems like every other station has, every other broadcast network, you know, eventually you kind of end up going either to the right or to the left, because that's where the controversy is, and that's where the energy is.
Yeah, are you saying that the media, established cable news networks, print media, online media, has become sort of ancillary or adjacent to the political parties on the far end of the political spectrum?
Well, I don't know if that's the right way to put it.
Two sides of the same coin, is basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people who make these decisions, and you would probably tell me it's the advertisers, you know, because advertising is what runs the media machine, have decided it's more profitable to be controversial, and that's what people want. I don't know if that's the right diagnosis. I'm not sure that's really what people want. I mean, there are some people who do, but I think a lot of people just want to be able to turn on the TV or go online and find out what's actually going on and have a thoughtful, you know, point counterpoint, right and left, but they aren't looking for just one-sided. And that too often that's what we get. I mean, I think I represent a great state. It's a diverse state. I'm really lucky in that regard. We're not real red or real blue. We're more purplish. I kind of like that. I guess we're hewing more red these days.
Yeah.
But a lot of states, pretty much are considered in the red column or the blue column, and a lot of districts, partly because of gerrymandering, where you rewrite a district so that it can be a Republican district or a Democrat district. So those are leading to some of these.
I can't help it. I shouldn't ask this because it's boring and nobody understands it. But you said something a minute ago about primaries. Do you favor going to a sort of a California-style open primary, where just the top two finishers, regardless of party, go to the general election?
I've looked at that. I've also looked at this ranked voting they do in places like Maine and Alaska. It seems kind of complicated to me, honestly. It takes forever to get the results, which I think is a problem in elections these days. Let's have the results right away. People start to distrust the election process when it takes a month to get the results. The simpler way is just to say, hey, let's make the districts more representative of the state or the country, and let's have an election with a group of voters who are more evenly divided, rather than trying to carve out. I remember when I was in the House, the Democrats insisted on taking sort of part of what would naturally have been my district and putting it in another district because it was viewed as a more Democratic area. I was happy to represent that area and actually fought for keeping it in the district. Now, I had a pretty Republican district, to be honest, so it didn't make that much difference. But I thought, why take these people? It's almost like a sore thumb was sticking out, like it didn't really fit in the other district in terms of the geography, but people wanted to reconfigure it for political purposes. So I think it should be just basically the lines that are the political jurisdictions, the counties, the cities, and
put an end to gerrymandering.
Fall where they may, yeah. Let the chips fall where they may.
Okay. I'm going to go out on a limb and say your brand of conservatism, as I understand it, is sort of the Reagan ideals of free trade, a muscular foreign policy, Main Street Chamber of Commerce conservatism. It's out of favor now in the Republican Party. Am I right or wrong? And if I'm right, what happened?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, look, my brand of conservatism is about helping people. And one way you help people, you mentioned trade, is you be sure that there is a level playing field. And that's one thing that, you would probably say that's the more populist conservative approach that
not anymore.
Donald Trump talked about. Well, no, but I'm saying, to have a level playing field, it means that you have to be tougher on China. You have to be tougher on countries that aren't playing by the rules. And that's not traditional conservatism, which would be more purely free trade. And so, I'm not purely free trade. I believe the trade is really important. We should do much more of it. I'm upset with the Biden administration for not doing free trade agreements anymore. But I also think that you need to be able to go to American workers and say with a straight face, this isn't a fixed game. Like, other countries like China can't come in here and subsidize their products or sell them at below their cost and unfairly compete with you. You got a level playing field, you got to compete, and I think you can. And it's a little more complicated than just, old conservatism versus new conservatism. My view is there's not one philosophy that would dictate all my positions. It's based on what's best for Ohio as an independent voice. Let's take the infrastructure bill, for example.
Okay.
For 15, five
administrations. I mean, let's take it.
Probably.
You voted for the infrastructure bill. A number of Republicans did in the Senate, right? Which brought the ire of the former president and his adherents or followers, the people who voted for him.
Yeah.
So the Republican Party has changed when the leader of the party doesn't want an infrastructure bill.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty simple. I mean, you had, for 5 administrations in a row, you had presidents, saying, we've got to get infrastructure fixed. In fact, they went
including the former President Trump.
Including the former president. And they go under a bridge in Cincinnati called the Brent Spence Bridge.
Yes.
And they would hold a press conference, and I was at some of those. And nothing happened, forever. I mean, literally for 25 or 30 years, I've been working on the Brent Spence Bridge, and nothing was happening. And it's a huge bridge. It's the confluence of 2 big interstate highways, incredibly unsafe, rush hour backups every day. So we finally said, okay, President Biden, you say you have an infrastructure bill. Let's take out everything that's not infrastructure in it, just the core. Let's take out all your big tax increases you had in it. And on a bipartisan basis, let's get it done. And you're right, President Trump didn't like it much. But his reason for not liking it, I think, was more about the fact that we were giving President Biden a victory, which I never viewed it that way. We were giving American people a victory.
Right, okay.
Republicans, Democrats, but more importantly, the people of America who have been hearing for years, hey, we want to fix your roads and bridges and give you high-speed internet. Well, let's do it.
Okay.
And that's what that infrastructure bill is all about. And it's working.
All right, I just want to pursue this line of questioning for a second. In your career, you voted for NAFTA. You voted for the Iraq War resolution. As the United States trade representative, you negotiated a central free trade agreement. Do you regret any of that? And have those deals made America weaker or stronger?
Well, I think on the trade front, you got to have trade with other countries. It needs to be fair. It needs to be balanced. I think those agreements represent that. I supported the USMCA, which was an update of the NAFTA agreement, and I'm glad I did that as well. Neither is perfect, by the way, but both were good because it locks us into this North American compact with Canada and Mexico where we can compete with China and other countries and the European Union and so on. We should do more of that, not less, by the way. Every country in the world is doing trade agreements now except us. Mm-hmm. And I was just in Latin America and they want to do trade agreements with us. Ecuador is a good example. Instead, they're turning to China to do an agreement with China because we won't do one with them and they're falling behind. So I think that was good. In terms of the Iraq War, I mean, I believed the stuff that wasn't necessarily true about weapons of mass destruction because we were told that. But it was a tough vote. My concern at the time, which I expressed probably to you and to others, was the hard part is going to be putting the pieces back together. I have no concern about us going in and beating Saddam Hussein, who had gone into Kuwait illegally and done a lot of bad things. So that's fine. But country building, rebuilding the country is not the strength of our military. Never has been. It's not their responsibility. It's not what they're trained to do. So that was my concern, and I think we made a mistake by assuming that we could kind of recreate Iraq into a democratic image. It wasn't ever going to be a Jeffersonian democracy, but we tried to do something that I think the military was not equipped to do, and it was not fair to ask them to do.
A lot of people here, we were talking about bipartisanship and the lack of it. A lot of people here talk about bipartisanship, but a lot of times when members of Congress talk about it, it's sort of a sucker punch. In other words, you propose something that you know the other side isn't going to support, and then when they don't support it, you accuse those no good such and suches of, not you, but typically, of not being bipartisan. They're just partisans and, so you've walked the walk and you've talked the talk, as we talked about during, about the infrastructure bill and other efforts that you've made to reach across the aisle. How is that going to change? How are people going to, is it just ultimately up to the voters? I mean, how is that going, how is bipartisanship going to rule Washington, if it ever did? But now is an intensely partisan time. How is that going to change?
I think voters need to speak up. I think most voters hire you to do a job, and the job is to get results for them and their families. And if you follow that line of thinking, that's why you get elected, not to, again, throw out the partisan jabs on broadcast media or online, not to be in the attack mode, but instead be in the mode of saying, how do we move forward? How do we get a result around here? The only way to get a result, for the most part, is to work with the other side. There are a couple of exceptions, like the reconciliation bills that the Democrats just did that I didn't support, that I think are bad for the country. But if it's going to be a result that's lasting at all, and if it's going to be one that can get through 60 votes in the Senate and be signed into law by the President, by definition, it really has had to have been bipartisan over my 25 years in the House and the Senate. So I think that's the way forward. And look, I was told this morning by my team that we have 195 bills during my 12 years in the Senate alone that have been signed into law, one just yesterday. And by definition, almost all of those were bipartisan. So we have walked the walk in that sense. And I think, look, I think that's what my constituents, for the most part, want. Not all constituents. Some are mad at me because they don't like the idea of bipartisanship. But most say, look, Portman, we hired you to actually get something done, not just to go, out there and throw out the partisan jabs. And I think that's what my team has done. Okay. A tribute to my staff who've had to work through all this. And by the way, that involves finding common ground. What does that mean? That means you start here, the other side starts here, you respect each other, listen to each other, and eventually you come together and find where you can move forward. Okay. That means it's not perfect, but it makes progress for the country. Infrastructure is an example of that.
All right. Your fine press secretary, Matt Lloyd's giving me the high sign, so I do have a couple of questions. I promise I wouldn't make this all about the former president, but I just want to ask you. His political support seems to be weakening within the Republican Party. Has he changed, or has the mood of the country changed? And why does it take him to explicitly talk about terminating the Constitution to sort of break the dam of support that he's had over the last 6 years?
Well, you know, it's complicated with Donald Trump. I think he did a lot of good things on the policy front, and I was a big part of a lot of that. 82 of my bills, 82 were signed into law by President Trump, including on human trafficking, fighting the opioid epidemic, tax cuts and tax reform, you know, the national parks, historic legislation to help our parks. So we got a lot done in the Trump years, and I'm proud of that. On the other hand, the style, the personality, the caustic nature of the political debate is not something that, you know, fits my interests or I think Ohio's. So that's how it always is, you know. So you want to work with him when he's there as president, as I tried to do, but you also call it out when you disagree. And there were a number of times when we disagreed, but at the same time, I always tried to do it respectfully, to say, look, I disagree with you on policy, or in terms of the recent stuff you're talking about with terminating parts of the Constitution. I was very clear about that. You know, no president has the ability or right to do that, and you know, that's not what our country's founded on. So I mean, you just have to be honest.
You think you'll be the nominee in 2024?
Well, I have an opinion that no one else probably has, which is I think in the end President Trump's unlikely to run, and I think that because I do see what the polling data is doing, and people who believe he did a good job as president don't necessarily believe that he ought to run for president again. That's certainly true in Ohio. Probably 75% of Ohioans who are Republican primary voters have a favorable opinion of the president. So it's very high. I mean, he's a big factor in our party. But when you ask the second question, but do you think he ought to run for president, that number goes down to something like 50%. And when you ask, you know, how do you think he matches up with other people, particularly Governor DeSantis of Florida, you see more and more polls saying that people are looking for somebody else, somebody new. And that's not a surprise. I mean, you know, he's already been president. I think a lot of people are going to want to say, let's look to the future.
Okay, what's next for Senator Rob Portman?
I'm going home. I can't wait, be home full time, do some stuff with the University of Cincinnati, which I'm excited about, focusing on public service and all the things we talked about today on how you get things done by listening to people, respecting people, finding that common ground. Hope to do some stuff in the private sector. I want to get back to that. I love it. And then help on public policy and, you know, do some good, I hope, through some charitable work. So I'm excited to be going home.
All right, well, congratulations. Thanks,
Mike.